Hey, welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. I'm so glad to be with you here today. We took a week off last week for Good Friday, Easter, all that great stuff going on at church. So we had a full weekend. My son's birthday was last weekend, so we were absolutely exhausted after last weekend. But I'm really glad to be back here with you. I want to go ahead and give my guest an introduction. His name is Joe Rigney. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me, Chase.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to kind of set up Joe with a bit of biographic information. I told Joe before we got on the air, what I care about most is he is the first Fighting Texas Aggie I've had on the show.
There you go.
We use a phrase down there called red ass. I don't particularly perceive Joe as someone who is that. And so I am that. I've got that picture on my wall, which you can't see if you're listening, is my granddad in the Corps in the 30s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so yeah, that's
cool.
part of my story. Yeah, for sure. But Joe's up in the Twin Cities.
Yep.
And he's the president and associate professor of theology and literature at Bethlehem College and Seminary. He's authored 5 books. Man, I could talk a lot about some of these books. One of them was really helpful for me. I think I mentioned that to Joe before, The Things of Earth, Treasuring God by Enjoying His Gifts. So many illustrations there connected with me, at least, and I just found it really helpful to really dive into what does it mean to desire God and enjoy God in all things, but still enjoy His good creation. He's also a pastor at Cities Church in St. Paul and serves as a teacher at Desiring God. He and his wife, Jenny, moved up there in 2005 to participate in Bethlehem's eldership training program. And so he's been doing a lot of good work up there. But Joe, thank you so much again for being on the show today.
Yeah, great to be here.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of hear from you first, I mean, you started in Texas, moved up to Bethlehem. That was in 2005, it sounds like. I just would love to hear more about your journey with Jesus, what it's been like to kind of like, did you grow up in the church? What was that like for you? And what made you kind of pursue not only the pastorate, but the kind of academic Christian world?
Yeah, so I apparently like extremes because I grew up in West Texas, and which is a desert, and so there was 2 seasons. It was hot and more hot, and so I grew up out there, and then now I live in Minnesota, where it's still cold and it's almost May. So so we like the extreme. So yeah, I grew up in West Texas, and that's where I became a Christian. Grew up in the church. We were in a Presbyterian church when I was younger, moved over to the Baptist church when I was in elementary school. That's where I, heard the gospel, responded. And in that church, my parents also kind of been nominal-ish, good West Texas church attenders. But then it was at that church they got involved in the Sunday school class and was really transformative. My dad, I think, really became a Christian there. We were actually baptized at the same time.
Oh, wow.
When I was about 12. And in the same service. So that was really kind of a special thing. My dad died in 2013. So it's kind of a special, looking back on that. And then we were a part of a church plant out of that Baptist church we were part of, planted a church across town, which was a little more kind of a really interesting mix of John Piper theology and Bill Hybels ecclesiology. So if you just imagine trying to square that circle, but they did. So it was very kind of seeker sensitive, big, not initially because we were in a school, but like became like laser light show-ish kind of stuff, high production values, let's put it that way. But the pastor had been, a Southern guy in the early Moeller years and loved, God's passion for His glory. And so it was this really kind of, I didn't know, you don't know at the time when you're 15, 16, 17 years old. Looking back, it's like, that was really weird. I don't think there was probably another church like that. But that was a really formative time for me. He kind of discipled me through my pastor kind of discipled me through high school. And then when I was 18, I was big into football. Played Friday Night Lights, West Texas. That was my deal. That was my jam in high school. And but then went to Texas A&M, and that's where I first actually formally encountered Piper. I didn't realize that that's what had been channeled through my pastor. But then heard Piper, and that was kind of like a, rocket went off in my head and in my soul. And so Christian hedonism and went all in on that. That just resonated deeply with my own experience, my own reading of scriptures. And so that kind of, it sort of took off from there. I felt called to ministry kind of in that senior year of high school, freshman year of college. And then over the course of college, was involved in a number of different ministries, Bible studies, and just really loved it. I loved teaching. It became increasingly clear, and I'd say now even more so. I can look back and say, if a teacher is someone who loves to tell other people about the things that fascinate them, like that's just what I am. I'm just a born teacher. And then I happen to be someone who's also fascinated by a lot of different things. So that's also kind of fun. I'm more of a generalist than a specialist. So Texas A&M. I met my wife there. At some point, I think it was 2003. I went up to the first Bethlehem National Conference on Jonathan Edwards, and I was like, "Whoa, there's this whole world here." And they have a school, and so I had a friend who was a couple years ahead of me in high school who had ended up there. He's now a pastor in Orlando, and so I stayed with him, and he was telling me about this elder training program they had at Piper's Church, and so I was like, I want to come do that.
Okay.
And so that's what, so when I was graduating from college, it was, I think I applied to Bethlehem first, and then started dating and got engaged to my wife soon after, because it was like, I'm moving to Minnesota in about 6 months. And so
Sure.
you want to come? And thankfully she did. And so then we moved up here fall 2005, and we thought we were coming for like a couple years, like, 2-year type deal. And then we'd go be a pastor, plant a church. I was kind of, it's kind of in the heady days of Acts 29 and Driscoll and all that kind of stuff, Chandler. So I kind of wanted to kind of looking at that. That's my wife thought, we're going to go to Minnesota for 2 years, and then we'll come back down to Texas and do some church planting or something.
Yeah.
And now here we've been here for 17. And so the Lord had different plans there. So that's kind of, maybe last thing you mentioned, academic, how did I get into academic? So I planned to be a pastor, was going through the Bethlehem apprenticeship. And then I think in my second or third year, I guess it was going into my third year, they were starting up a 1-year undergraduate program it was called the Bethlehem Institute at the time. 1-year undergraduate program that my best friend was kind of pioneering. And he said, "Hey, we're going to have a second cohort of students. Do you want to come help?" And I was like, "Sure, this sounds great." And so I did. And then it was like, "Oh yeah, this is what I need to do." I love preaching. I love preaching. I love pastoring. I now do that, but it became pretty clear that my sort of the classroom was where I really thrived at some level, and so that kind of then kept us after even I finished the program. It was like, well, I'm doing this now. Let's do this for a few years, see how it goes. So we kind of did it for 5, and then at 5 years, kind of check the tires. Like, how's this feel? Do another 5, and then now all of a sudden we've been here forever. And so through that, jumping into the ground floor there of Bethlehem was then when, a couple years later, we started Bethlehem College and Seminary. So I was there on the ground floor and was one of the guys who was mainly building our college.
Okay, that's awesome. And where did you do your PhD?
So I got a degrees wise. So the BA from Texas A&M in speech communication with a minor in English, as my wife and we both have the same major and minor. We like to say we went to college to learn to speak in our own language. And then I've got an MA from Bethlehem. I've got another master's from New St. Andrews in Idaho in classical Christian studies. So when I was helping to shape kind of the great book side of Bethlehem's programs, I was like, I need to go get some more depth there. So I went out to NSA in a distance program and got a second master's. And then I did my PhD at Union School of Theology in England in partnership. They kind of do a partnership thing with, at the time, it was University of Chester. So Mike Reeves was my doctoral supervisor for that program. It was all distance. I did it all here and then went over there to defend a few years ago. And so, yeah, it was a really great experience and worked really well for me. So like it was a funny deal. I kind of got the job. Like I got the teaching job before I had the degrees, just because I was there on a ground floor of a startup. Right. And so then I was sort of like backfilling, like, okay, what do I need to know to do this? And so I was getting degrees. I think I was in school from kindergarten until I was like 37 with my PhD. And I never stopped, but I was, for 10 or 12 of those years, I was actually full-time teaching.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Yeah, the Union one is the one I'm doing as well. And those guys over there are great guys. So yeah, I'm really glad to hear more of your story, and I could ask a lot of questions. We could talk about, breakaway and other stuff at Texas A&M. That'd be a really fun thing to dive into.
Yeah, old school.
But with kind of the work you're teaching at a seminary, you're helping with its city's church, right? In St.
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah, so 2015, we planted Cities Church. We're a North American Mission Board plant, but we planted out of Bethlehem.
Okay.
And that was kind of a group of younger leaders at Bethlehem. So David Mathis, who's a teacher at Desiring God, and then Jonathan Parnell, who was one of our seminary graduates, as well as another Bethlehem elder. We kind of were the core leadership that launched out 2015 with about 50 or so people. And so, yeah, we've been doing that for the last 7 years. So it's kind of interesting. So, Parnell's the lead pastor. He's the vocational guy. I'm technically non-vocational in the sense that I'm a professor by day, pastor by night. But the way we structured it is more of a team preaching model where up until I took the presidency at Bethlehem, I was preaching probably once a month. Parnell would preach twice a month. Mathis would preach once, a little bit less. And then we had fill in with some other guys.
Yeah.
And so it was a team preaching model, which was great because it basically meant I was able to do full-time professoring, which is what I loved. But I really did have this kind of pastoral itch and this desire to preach. But I didn't want to be a full-time preaching pastor. And so this has kind of been the ideal scenario for me to be able to get in the pulpit every so often, and then still kind of live in the classroom.
That's great. I don't want to talk too much inside baseball for my listeners, but one of the questions I have, and we can always cut this and post or something, but it related to Bethlehem, planting out of Bethlehem. Bethlehem was Converge, right? Or General Baptist, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then y'all planted out of there, but you went with SBC. What were some of the considerations y'all weighed when you decided to not go with Converge?
Yeah, so Bethlehem's Converge, or it used to be Baptist General Conference. And, there was a bunch of big fights that predated my time here in Minnesota in the BGC over open theism. So the open theism thing, when that kind of blew up just in the wider deal, was really kind of ground zero for that was BGC in the Twin Cities, because Piper was in Minneapolis and Greg Boyd is in St. Paul. And they were both part of BGC churches. And so Piper kind of fought that battle at the BGC and basically lost. They didn't want to, it wasn't that everybody was open theist, but they didn't want to draw the line there.
Oh.
I don't know what it was like prior to that in terms of Bethlehem's engagement with the denomination, but really, even though technically Bethlehem still Converge, there's very little active denominational participation. And obviously, we've started our own school. So, the Bethel is a denominational school and we just don't, have anything much to do with them. Even though Piper was a professor there back in the 70s, a lot of guys, Schreiner was there, Grudem was there, Bob Stein was there. So, Bethel used to have this kind of world-class evangelical faculty, and now is where it is. It has gone the way of so many schools. So then when we were planning to plant, Bethlehem has a church planting network, Treasuring Christ Together, which we're a part of. But when it came to thinking through sort of the coaching side, the resourcing side, the North American Mission Board was just very much, kicking it into high gear about the time we were planting. And so we said, hey, that's going to be really helpful. And it's been a really fruitful thing for us. So Jonathan is now our lead pastor. Jonathan Parnell is the Send City missionary for the Twin Cities. So NAM has a number of strategic urban centers that they focus on, and the Twin Cities is one. And so we kind of our church is actively involved in the sort of church planning efforts in the wider metro. So we've planted a couple of churches over the last couple of years out of ours, and then are involved in all sorts of other stuff. So that's just that's why we shifted over, and it's been a really great fit. We love it's kind of interesting in terms of the SBC world, because I think that Minnesota, Wisconsin, as far as the SBC is concerned, is kind of like an unreached people group. So when they look at their map, there's not a lot of stuff up here.
Yeah.
But that also means that we're kind of insulated from a lot of some of the other the politics and some of the other long-standing tensions. We just kind of do our thing. We're just, hey, we want to plant churches and love Jesus and make him impossible to ignore in the Twin Cities. So we're just going to do that, guys. Thanks. Yeah. And it works really well. So we love it.
That's awesome. That's good to hear.
Yeah.
All right, so you planted a church. You're now the president of a seminary.
Yep.
Um, and some of the content I've been kind of following you and tracking with you on different discussions you've been having publicly, whether you want to call it public theology or not, whatever it is. But I've just found some of the things you've been talking about really helpful. Like we talked before we got on air about kind of your conversation on empathy, and I was kind of slow to come on
Sure.
and understand that perspective, but I found it really insightful, and I think you got a lot of flack for that. One of the things that came up recently, and this is something I struggle with, and I think a lot of people are struggling with, is when I look at the ministry of Jesus, and I see him interacting with different crowds and different groups. A lot of people on a variety of positions will try to like identify. They'll try to do almost a typological. They'll go like, well, Jesus treated these people this way, therefore we treat these
Yep.
people this way today.
Yep.
And that's inevitable. It's not like that's bad or wrong. It's just kind of the way a lot of people read the Bible. And as good Christians, we want to be able to take the life of Christ and use it as the template for how we
Yep.
love others. I mean, we should do that. But something that you mentioned that I found really interesting is this idea of sexual Pharisees, because
Yep.
the tension I feel and the tension I think other people see is a lot of people really want to punch hard on the church because they view the church as the Pharisees, right? The religious
Yeah.
people of the day. So Jesus hit that at the religious people of the day. Therefore, the religious people today are the church. Therefore, we should punch at church leaders.
Yep.
And that, I mean, you can kind of see that logic play out. But what you're suggesting, or what I think you're suggesting, this is why I'm bringing it up, is that actually the religious leaders over the day are these sexual Pharisees. And I'll put the link to this Twitter thread that you posted
Yep.
about it in the kind of show notes. But can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so where that came from was exactly what you described, and I have great regard. Tim Keller's been a great blessing to my own life. I'm really grateful for his ministry. Reason for God's a fantastic book, and I've really benefited over the years from him. But this is a place where I think a well-intentioned kind of paradigm for cultural and evangelistic engagement kind of misses something. It leaves something out. And so Keller's I'm using him just as an example because he's probably the one that many people have heard do this, and it's a very effective thing. It's sort of the prodigal son story approach to evangelism and cultural engagement, which is, okay, you got the two sons. You've got the tax collector sinner son who takes it. He's the debauched immorality, irreligion, I think is the word that Keller frequently uses, and he goes off into the far country and blows the inheritance on prostitutes and drugs. And then you've got the older brother, the Pharisee, who stays home, but is still just as lost, right? Doesn't know that everything belongs to him, doesn't know what his father is really like, so that when the younger son comes home repentant, he's stiff arms him and is not rejoicing in the recovery of the lost son. And so these are sort of two kind of categories then for the irreligious sinners and religious sinners. And both of them are lost and need Jesus. I saw a video at one point that was like about those parables, those three parables there that Jesus is telling about the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And it goes from like 99 sheep are fine, one sheep is lost. And so the guy was making the point, okay, so how many people are lost? Like, oh, 1 out of 100. And then you move over and it was like one coin out of 10. Oh, okay, 1 out of 10. That's different. And then you get to the other one, it's like actually 1 out of 2. And then by the end of the story, you're like, oh, both. Like, we're all lost. And like, that was a really good thing about what Jesus is doing, is showing like the universal lostness. And you can be lost in two very different ways. The challenge comes is when that begins, just kind of that paradigm of irreligious and religious sinners gets kind of picked up and just plopped down directly on our current cultural environment. And so, because then you typecast and you say, okay, well, who are the irreligious sinners? Well, they're the ones who are doing this debauched sexual immorality. And then who are the religious sinners? Those are the people in church. And so this is frequently used as a kind of exhortation, is a mild way to put it. Cudgel would be a stronger way to say, hey, Christians, you know what? You're not being like Jesus to the irreligious sinners of the day. And so as I thought about that more, I was like, actually there is a third category there, because that's not present in the Jesus story, because I don't know that it was actually a live issue in the cultural environment in which he was speaking. Like, his context, I don't think necessarily had this in the same way, although maybe it actually kind of did. I'll come back to that. But it's sort of the combination of those two sins. If there's sort of the public immorality, sexual sin, drunkenness, worldliness, that sort of type thing, and then there's sort of this religious pride, well, you can actually combine those sins. Like they're separate in the story, in the parable, and they're separate in terms of Pharisees and tax collectors, the Pharisee and the tax collector story, right? All of those sort of, hey, there's these two ways, both are wrong, and one of them's worse because it's high-handed pride. And it's like, yeah, but you could combine the high-handedness of the Pharisee with the debauchery of the tax collector and the prostitute. Like those could actually come together. That's literally what a gay pride parade is, right? It's the fusion of those two sins. So maybe one way to put it is, I think that when Keller has again, an instance with no malice in my heart towards him, like when he sliced that distinction as sort of like the difference between these two sinners is irreligious and religious. I actually think that the better biblical slicing is high-handed versus Bible talks about kind of unintentional sins or sins of error, low-handed sins, if you want to call it that way. It's actually, that's the contrast, and the form of high-handed sin could vary. It could take a very religious, hypocritical form, but it also could take a very sort of debauched, immoral form. And I think that's the one that it's taken in our culture. So over the years, I've just done a lot of, when we preached through the Gospel of Mark, and it was kind of like, well, let's talk about how are the Pharisees presented in the Gospel of Mark? And it's like, well, they're the cultural gatekeepers. They're popular. Everybody like the Pharisees are the popular sect over against the Sadducees, who are off in Jerusalem. The Pharisees are the ones among the people. They're cultural gatekeepers. They're teachers. They're catechizing. They're drawing people in. And some of the stuff that they say is fine, but then there's this deep underbelly that's just deeply, deeply wrong, and this high-handed hypocrisy. And it's kind of like, well, if you look around today, is the main place we see it. I'm not denying that can be present in a church. It certainly is and can be. But I'm saying, if you look out there, where is high-handed sin most obvious? And I think it is more among this sort of sexual Pharisee, the person who is high-handed in their sexual immorality, in their worldliness, but has the pride and the stiff-necked element that the Pharisees had.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I really like the phrase, whether it's good or biblical.
Yeah.
I think it identifies something, particularly the phrase "cultural gatekeeper."
Yeah.
And that's a discussion I keep getting into with a lot of friends, is because I'll talk a lot with a lot of different pastors about this topic, and we'll have some pretty good disagreements on it. But to me, it always comes back to is like, who has the most power in society? If you want to use the power paradigm as kind of a reductionistic method of analysis,
Yep.
then who in our society are the cultural gatekeepers? Who are the ones that are running the corporations, that are running the media, that are running? And you don't even have, it's not a conspiracy. It's just like, look at the ones who are pushing catechizing a certain way.
Yep.
And what is their common message? And
Yep.
so, for a lot of Christians, it was a really easy, like when we planted in 2011, when we planted, it was really easy to kind of like play the card or play the style of both and two ditches on the side of the road.
Yeah. Third way.
Yeah. And so I think you can still employ that. As I've said on the podcast, I've done a whole episode on that method, but it's just become more apparent and an untenable strategy. And what that strategy really was effective at is winning Christians who grew up in the church, who were like bummed out that their parents weren't that cool. And so then they would come to our church play and they'd be like, "Oh, y'all play rock music and you drink beer and you kind of dunk on the church, but you're trying to love the culture too." And like, that was really cool for people. Like, it seemed really innovative.
There was a time when that was cool.
Yeah.
Right.
And now I think a lot of people, at least in my church, and I think a lot of people across the country, at least in the United States, in the North American context, it's like there's this tension where it's like, I'm trying to adopt a new tactic and a new approach. And some of my people are just going like, it feels different. Like I believe what you're saying, but like, that's not the kind of church I joined originally. And I'm like, I have so much patience. I want to have so much patience with that. And I try to, where it's like, yeah, I totally get that. Let's come along. Let's have conversations about that. Let's talk more about that. But I think there's like a cognitive dissonance, because so many people for the last 10 years have been incubated in, whether you call it missional or whatever you want to call it, an approach that now we're having to adapt a new tactic where we're engaging the cultural gatekeepers, the kind of sexual Pharisees, where you've got, I mean, I don't know about up there, but we've got, the trans flag flying above City Hall in June. And so, I'm preaching a sermon where I'm calling out the rainbow flag as a marker of sexual depravity in our city. And for a lot of our church, they're like, yes, thank you for saying that, because they're going to work and they're like, if you don't wear the rainbow pin, you're a bigot.
Right.
If you don't put your pronouns in your bio, you're a bigot.
Yep.
And so a lot of people are feeling this pressure, but there's still some Christians who are like, gosh, that feels weird. That feels like Jerry Falwell to me. That feels like my parents watching Fox News. And I'm like, that's not what I don't even watch Fox News. Like, that's not what we're doing here. But do you sense that tension as well?
Yeah, totally. And I think what you said about the way our paradigms, it's related somewhat to what Aaron Wren has talked about, I think, in terms of positive, neutral, and negative world Christianity. And that kind of missional paradigm you described was really geared toward a neutral world where being a Christian was kind of this anomaly. You're a little bit weird, but we're not necessarily overtly hostile in the way that it is now. And so it was an attempt to kind of say, hey, I want to kind of, if I come at you straight, walls go up. But if I kind of come at you sideways and kind of say, hey, actually, we're not that different. Like, we've got a lot of the same temporal interests, whether it's music or sports or craft beer or whatever. And it was a way of kind of like, we're going to build relationships with people because we want them to know Jesus. And that's exactly right. And so we don't want to come across as overly judgmental. We want to be slow and patient in order to draw people along, rather than simply saying, you may not do that. That's evil. And so I get that was just very shaping for me. I thought that way, and still think that way in a lot of contexts. Like I have relationships with people where that's precisely how I'm engaging at a personal level. The danger is if that's the only mode that you have, if that's the only register that you operate in, then I'll say the sexual Pharisee, older brother, younger brother thing. The other way to talk about that is one I picked up from Doug Wilson. The way he talks about this is apostles from the world and refugees from the world. So you have sinners in the world, but Jesus treats apostles from the world very differently than refugees. And refugees are those who are broken and they know it, and they're looking for something and they want out, and you're trying to help. You want to be a place where refugees can come and just collapse. That's prodigal son, right? Coming home. They just let the refugee come home and just collapse. But then you have the apostle from the world, who is he's not there to like fall into the arms of Jesus and his brokenness. He's there to evangelize your church.
Right.
He wants to convert you. And that's where the Pharisee thing actually becomes really illuminating, because this is what Jesus is condemning the Pharisees for. You travel over land and sea seeking converts, and when you find one, you make him twice the son of hell that you are. Like, the Pharisees were evangelistic in their ways of operating. And the other thing that, so basically here's a mistake about the way that we think about the Pharisees. We think sometimes that, they were the ones who really loved the law and they were too focused on the law and they kept the law too much. And it was like, actually, Jesus says your righteousness needs to exceed theirs because they're not keeping it. They do a lot of lip service, but they actually nullify the law by their traditions, by the commandments of God are nullified by their traditions. And so there's that famous one where the Pharisees thought, they had this thing: if you declared something korban, then it was given to God, and so they would do that about things, and therefore they wouldn't take care of their parents. Sorry, mom, dad, I've declared my stuff korban; it's offered to God, and therefore I'm not going to take care of you the way that the fifth commandment requires. And Jesus rebuked this, and he says, "You think you're nullifying the fifth commandment by your declaration of korban." And then I go, yeah, who's doing something like that today? Well, it's like you got people declaring, diversity, equity, inclusion, and then nullifying the seventh commandment, right? Like it's adultery, sexual ethics, they don't matter at all because I've declared this thing okay. And so the tradition of men nullifies and voids the commandment of God. And they're apostles, they're evangelistic. They want you to come to their seminar. They want to train you. They want to shape you, and they want to shape your kids. They want to catechize your kids. And so in that respect, how did Jesus treat apostles from the world? And it's like, he was not gentle with them, right? When they came to him quietly, Nicodemus or Joseph or somebody like that, he was perfectly willing to receive them in dialogue and converse and call them to himself. And some of them did. But he was a scrapper, and woe to you, liars, hypocrites. And so having that kind of orientation towards apostles from the world, especially, I think that's the other thing is, there's professing Christians. There's large wings of the church that are talking and thinking this way. And if we orient to them simply as refugee, in that refugee category, then basically we're going to let the wolves in, which I think is part of what happens. Is it's related to the untethered empathy thing. Oh, we treat you like you're hurt and broken, when actually you're trying to evangelize and change us. And so learning to be able to resist the apostles from the world is fundamental to Christian, especially for Christian leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of been my heart lately, is like I see all these people who are disillusioned with what let's riff on that the apostles from the world are coming into their workplace, are coming into our city, are speaking on TV, are on, I mean, Spotify commercials, TV, just all of it. They're everywhere. And they're exhausted. Like a lot of normal people are exhausted by it because they know they can't live up to it. Because ultimately it feels like, do you just want me to die? Like whether it's the environmental movement or whether it's diversity, it feels like they set up standards that you can never achieve. And so when you do that to people, they feel crushed and weighed down because you've created a law that just is destroying their humanity and trying to give them an alternative means of salvation.
Yeah.
So these people are what you called refugees in that sense. And I'm just trying to give them a place where it's like, come to our church, come hear the gospel and experience an alternative to that kind of burdensome lifestyle. And we're seeing people respond to that in really good ways. A lot of it is slower and bolder because, it's still called church and we're still Christians. And so they're still a little reluctant, but like there's a lot of resonance there culturally for those people.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And so you want to create the environment that's safe for sinners in that sense, right? That if you're the prodigal coming home, man, we left the light on and we're ready with the fatted calf. We're going to throw that party. But if the prodigal's coming home with a hooker on each arm and says, I need you to fund my Coke habit, right? Bake the cake, Dad.
Yeah.
Like, then Dad doesn't go, well, I guess we'll throw the party still. Because there's nothing to celebrate yet. He's not turned from the pit. He's not rejected the sin. He's still sinning with a high hand. It's like one of the other passages that's kind of shaped my thinking on this, because it's related to pastoral ministry and how we ought to orient, is in the book of Numbers. It's the story of Phineas, and Phineas, obviously they're in the camp, and this Israelite guy goes and takes a Midianite bride, which high-handed, don't do that, bad, that God said not to. And then he brings his Midianite bride, and he basically has a little pride parade coming down the thoroughfare there in the Israelite camp, just kind of strutting with his new Midianite bride. And then Moses and Aaron and the elders of Israel are over by the tent of meeting, and they see this and they're weeping. Like they're like, this is how horrible, this is grievous. Okay. And then Phineas says, yeah, tears aren't in this situation aren't enough. And so he goes and he grabs a spear, goes into the tent, and pins them both to the ground, right? And because of that stayed a plague. And God looks at Phineas's zeal and says, you'll make a great pastor, right? You'll make a great priest. I'm going to ordain you for a perpetual priesthood. Now, obviously, in our present context, redemptive historical situation has changed. We're not in ancient Israel, and pastors don't carry swords. But the principle of a zeal for God's name that doesn't simply lament the presence of high-handed rebellion in the church, but actually takes decisive and direct action in order to remove it, is a big part of what we're talking about. So here's this isn't broken sinner. This isn't I fell into sin and I'm broken over it. This is, I am flaunting it and I'm going to rub it in your face.
Right.
And the response from Phineas was, as a model, I think, was be zealous for the name of the God, be zealous for his holiness, and say, no, you may not. This is what Paul's doing, I think, in 1 Corinthians, in the ostracism passage, where he says, if there's someone who claims to be a brother and does all this stuff unrepentantly, practices it with no impunity, then, cast them out, right? Hand them over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, because the little leaven leavens the whole lump. If you tolerate that sort of thing, the church will be wrecked. And this is actually where I think the criticism of conservative evangelicals actually holds some water, in that we started, we kind of kicked it into high gear when the issue became something like homosexuality, but the um, tolerance for easy divorce and adultery and all sorts of heterosexual sins, fornication, all those sins was pretty substantial. We gave a lot of grace to folks who weren't really sorry over those things, and committed. So I knew of situations at churches I've been a part of years ago, where it was sort of like the husband left his wife for another woman, and then married the new woman, and then wanted to bring the new woman back to church. And the pastors were kind of like, well, we want to love people. And it was kind of like, no, you may not, like that. You hand that guy over. He's not sorry. He's flaunting. Here, look, I just disobeyed God and now I'm going to parade. Like, you've got to actually address it that way. And if you don't do it that way, then it's going to feel super weird later when all of a sudden you try to all of a sudden now you're going to draw a line around some of the sins.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, that it's just the way you're describing it, because I resonate with it, but we could talk about this for a long time. I think it would be really helpful for church planners and for pastors, because there's a lot of questions that start coming up. If you start talking this way, there's people in our congregation who are going to go, boy, that sounds harsh. Boy, that sounds unloving. And so we need to be educating more on this. It's not that we should back off because people have questions. It's like those questions are legitimate. Like you just mentioned, like, in a lot of ways, my argument is, and maybe I heard it from Doug or somebody else, but like the church was trans long before the culture was, when we started calling pastors women, and so like, if we don't own our responsibility as God's people, that we let in some of this stuff, this confusion, this moral stuff, that's not going to be helpful educationally. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah. One of the words that kind of gets associated with this is this idea of being winsome.
Yeah.
It's and with my friends, they know if they'll see me twitch like this, like if they say the word winsome around me now, and I think it's redeemable. I'm being silly in some ways, but at the same time, it kind of became like a word like missional, and how it's just like a buzzword, and I'm sure I've used it in writing and my preaching before. People that were at the well pre-2020 were probably like, Chase is really winsome, and so like it's not bad necessarily, but at the same time, it feels like an expired word in terms of usefulness. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think so. I have a similar thing, and one of the pieces of advice that I give a lot to, especially pastors, but really everybody, is pay attention to your hesitations, or in your phrase, note your twitches. Like, what things, whenever somebody says it, do you kind of have an instinctive or almost impulsive reaction to? That's a passion. Your passion just registered, and you should register and go, where'd that come from? What was that about? And that applies to all sorts of areas.
Sure.
And so I notice this whenever I kind of when I want to say a word and it just kind of wants to die in my mouth, and I just kind of want, no, don't say it. And it's like, why? What am I aware of? And this is a similar one for me, I think, where I've kind of gone, something feels off about it. And as we had a discussion with our pastoral team about this, because other guys were like, I don't feel that at all. And some of it, it's definitional, or it's like, what's the connotations of the word? So the good side, or the side that you can't ditch because it's Bible, is when Paul says, I become like Jews in order to win Jews, come like Gentiles in order to win Gentiles, so that by any means possible, I might save some, win some. So there's winsomeness, is simply seeking to, in all kinds of permissible and lawful ways, adapt yourself to remove as many barriers to the gospel as possible. So that's winsomeness. Okay, it's like that. Great, cool. There's this other element though, where, and this is something somebody penny dropped for me. I can't remember the article, but it was basically on winsomeness often entails adopting, imitating, reflecting the sensibilities of your target community. So wherever you are, who's the sum you're trying to win. And so in Paul, it's Jews or Gentiles, those under the law, those outside the law. We might say it's, I'm in an urban center, it's urbanites, progressive urbanites, versus if I was in a rural place or a suburban context or a different part of the country. So you got your target, and winsomeness seems to mean something like cultivate your sensibility so that you imitate or reflect theirs. Okay. Or presenting to them, hey, we're we're not, so you can be like me. And I think this is a biblical thing. I think this is what Paul does in that famous sermon. And it's later in Acts 22, 24, somewhere in there, where there's a mob outside and he's like, hey, give me the mic. And he goes out and he's like, he starts talking to him in Hebrew. And he starts talking about his story, telling his testimony. And the crowd just goes quiet because they're like, wait, we thought he was the Greek lover. Why is he speaking fluent Hebrew? And wait, he was this law keeper, and he was zealous for the law. And so Paul is doing all the things he can to like break down the barriers and be like, hey, I was just like you guys. I get it. I know where you're coming from. And so that's winsomeness, right? But of course, he ends that sermon with, and then God said, go and I'll send you far away to the Gentiles. And the text says, up until that point, they had listened in silent rapture. And at that point, they say, away with such a man, he doesn't deserve to live. And so Paul his winsomeness didn't extend to muting the hard edge of the gospel that these people needed to hear. So that's one thing. So if our winsomeness becomes an excuse, when does winsomeness just become pleasomeness, people pleasing, is a question, and is the danger that I would say for that thing. The other piece though is, in a highly politicized, reactive, tribal environment like we live in, imitating the sensibilities of our target community frequently includes communicating an antipathy to whoever their enemies are.
Exactly.
So it's sort of like, if I want to, and I think this cuts across the spectrum. So
Sure.
if I'm trying to reach, if I'm trying to be winsome to progressive, liberal, progressive, godless folks, the nuns here in the Twin Cities, it's like, I kind of want to communicate a little bit of, I'm not like those redneck MAGA hat people.
Sure.
That ain't me. And so it's like, I'm trying to like lean into their contempt or rejection or hostility to red state America. Flip side, if I'm trying to evangelize in a red state Bible Belty sort of context, Fox News, MAGA hat wearing, I'm going to start talking about owning the libs, and I'm going to really lean into, oh yeah, those guys. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to be, I'm conforming my sensibilities to theirs as a way of building the relationship, so that at some point I can give them the gospel. And that's the danger, is that becomes simply an excuse. We begin to adopt those same hostilities and despise those for whom Christ died. I think it's a graver thing when our winsomeness leads us to despise other Christians. Right. So, and that would include whether it's, the Trump loving, mega rally people, or for folks kind of probably more, with our sensibilities, it'd be a kind of contempt for David French, Russell Moore wing of evangelicalism. And there's a way, in other words, that I've got all kinds of issues with the way they're doing it, and want to be able to clearly state the differences. But
Sure.
if it's dripping with contempt, it's like, they're still brothers in Christ, and you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to have the contempt. That's in order to win some, or in order to score points with your target demographic.
Yeah, that's a good word, and that's. I think it's interesting when you reflect back on Paul, because he rarely adopts that kind of like antipathy towards other people, right?
Yeah.
And it's not like he's like, yeah, I agree with you. Those guys are horrible.
Yeah.
And so let's just talk about that. He's always trying to get, or at least the way it's recorded. And that's what's always interesting, is we have, by God's grace, we have these recorded episodes that are supposed to be both instructive and descriptive. But at the same time, I'm sure there were a lot of things going on in his own life and in his own engagement that we don't get to see. But rarely do we see kind of this adoption of this kind of method where that's my main strategy to reach people. Instead, he goes straight to the God-fearers in most towns when he plants a church, and that's his first people. He's trying to see who he can get out of there.
Yeah, who's already close. I'm going to start there and then build out. And I'm willing to call from hey, y'all come.
Right.
But he also recognizes that the Lord's at work to do things. Another way to think about the winsome thing that was a fruit, and this has to do with definitions, because I think sometimes we talk past each other because the word means different things to different people.
Sure.
Is winsomeness kind of a matter of emotional intelligence? Sort of basically, don't be a bull in a china shop. So it's winsomeness would be the opposite of tactlessness. Okay. So that's a kind of like emotional skill, read the room sort of capacity. And that could vary because you're going to be in different rooms, and therefore you're going to read the room differently in order to be winsome wherever you are.
Sure.
Or is it more objective? It's the opposite of quarrelsomeness.
Mm.
Okay, so in other words, in that case, you should be winsome all the time, and it should kind of look the same all the time, because you should never be quarrelsome. You should always be winsome. And I think that was a new question for me. It's like, okay, I think I hear it more as present, and I think actually that those different connotations there, is it the opposite of tactlessness or the opposite of quarrelsomeness?
Mm.
There's a kind of flowing back and forth between those two, where it's presented as a sort of a universal good, always be winsome, but then it's tied to a particular room, right? So in other words, it's objectively what winsomeness means is be winsome toward, and I think this is way, winsome toward progressive, religious leftist progressives, right? It's that group that is sort of determining the qualities and the presentation, their modes of speech,
right?
Their sensibilities are the ones that are the objective feature. And so if you don't have that, you're not being winsome. Instead, you're being quarrelsome. And I go, well, actually, though, I think that there's some other rooms where more direct speech and mixing it up a little bit more, it might actually be committing the gospel in a different way. So don't make the sensibilities of one community, don't universalize them in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the feedback I get from my friends. They'll say, "I like what you say, just not the way you say it."
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, I get that. Like, it's not like I'm oblivious to that, but yeah, that's a good way to put it. Thanks for sharing that. Well, if people wanted to kind of catch up and hear more of your thoughts, I mean, obviously they can read your book. I kind of gave a reference to The Things of Earth. Is there another book that's come out recently that my listeners should pick up?
Yeah. So the most recent book, now a year ago, I guess, it's called More Than a Battle, and it's on how to fight sexual sin. And so that would be one on dealing with sexual temptation, but also is one I think it's highly relevant. There's a lot of things in that book I've come to see that has more to do with just any kind of passion. So I've actually had a thought sometimes about reworking through that book and going, can I substitute another sin? Right. In other words, walking, because the book's about walking by the Spirit and not gratifying the passions of the flesh, lust of the flesh. And I'm focusing on sexual sin, but it's like there's a whole bunch of other passions of the flesh you could plug in there. And I think that it would be a very similar sort of the counsel, the biblical truths that would be relevant would be very similar.
Okay, that's great. And they can pick it up on Amazon?
Yeah, pick that one up on Amazon. I'll also drop, when I did my little thread on the sexual Pharisee thing, I'd forgotten that a number of years ago, I wrote an article, I think for Mere Orthodoxy, on church discipline and kind of you mentioned that sounds harsh,
right.
the ostracism kind of thing. And it was on that issue because it was in response, I think, to something Wesley Hill at the time had written about, hey, in a context where there's lots of sexual confusion in and outside the church about sexuality, we need to be more gentle and patient with people, and maybe not rush to church discipline. And I want to go, hey, patience, yes, if we're talking about refugees. But if we're going to be patient with refugees, we got to be really clear about apostles, right? You got to really draw some big, bright lines so that people can feel the force of it. And so I wrote kind of on 1 Corinthians 5 and the sexual Pharisee thing in relation to church discipline. So I'll send that to you. You can drop that in the show notes too.
Okay, that'd be great. Well, Joe, thanks so much for being on today. It's been delightful. I could just pick your brain on this stuff all day long. And so hopefully we'll get to have you back. Maybe one day I'll get to visit up there and see what you guys are working on. But thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right. If you listened to this show and you enjoyed it, I'd love for you to share it with somebody, send it to somebody, start a conversation, because that's why I started this show, is to have conversations. I'd love for you to have a conversation. I'm also going to put my Patreon link in the show notes because I need help just paying for the subscription to this habit I've got of making a podcast. So if you could sign up there, that'd be awesome. Anything helps. But we will see you next time. Thanks for listening.